In this video, we're going to be setting up a scoring system so that way when we hit the targets, we get some points, and then we're going to display those values on the heads-up display. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, we're going to run into a small issue. When we created our user interface, we called our setup HUD, and that HUD will be our crosshair currently, plus the score and things like that. Well, what we're going to do is take our HUD, rename it to crosshair, and set up a new widget for our HUD itself where we show our player's score. The reason for this is the crosshair is tied to our player, but we're not going to want the HUD or our player score tied to the player. We're going to want it tied to the controller, because while you may have one controller that controls your pawn or your character, if you destroy that pawn or character, let's say they die and we need to respawn, anything that was on that pawn or character is going to go along with it, which means if we stored the score inside the player, we're going to lose the player's score. Since there's one controller for your player, we're safe to store the score inside of the player's controller. So, with that said, let's go ahead and create a new user interface widget, and we'll call this one HUD. Now, we won't have an issue with renaming and using the same name, because when we renamed HUD to crosshair, anything that referenced it automatically had its reference changed. Let's open up our HUD. Let's quickly set up a score HUD. We'll drag in a text. Let's go ahead and give this a score value. Let's set it to size to content, and let's change its font to 32. Now let's put this in the bottom left corner, and we'll use the power of anchors to knock it to the bottom left corner. We'll set our position back to defaults, and you'll now notice it's off screen. Well, with our anchor being the top left, and our position being 0, 0, well, it's going to be right there in the bottom left corner. Let's go ahead and change our alignment to the bottom left by doing 0 and 1. And let's go ahead and move this slightly to the right and up. So we'll move it over 25, and we'll move it up 25, which is actually negative 25 because our anchor is down here. So now that we have 25, negative 25, we have our score label in the bottom left. Now we want to add an actual score value over here. Let's say it was 9999 to set up. Change its fonts to 32, and now we have this set up. Now we could go in, we could move things, we could resize things, we could re-anchor them, but let's use one of the other widgets called a horizontal panel to keep these things nice and organized. If we take our score, right-click, wrap with horizontal box, we're going to go ahead and put a horizontal box around our score, and everything's already in position. We can take our text, drag it onto the horizontal box, and now it's going to be next to it, no matter what. Let's change the alignment of our score to the left, and now we're done. Now, whenever we need to type in something new, it's going to be on the bottom left, and it's going to be justified appropriately. We will need to change this in the future, so let's go ahead and change this to a variable. So we'll change this to score TB for text block, and we'll make it a variable. Now, somehow we are going to need to change this. We're going to need an event or a function inside of here to go ahead and change our score whenever we need to. Now there's two ways of doing this. We can bind this text value to a variable. Now when you do that, basically it's going to check, it's a delegate, and it's going to check any time that variable's changed and update the score appropriately. One issue with that is it's going to take more resources to do that because you're basically binding and you're checking for that score change, that variable change all the time. For something like a score that may not be constantly changing, it may only change once every couple seconds, it's unnecessary to bind a value. What I prefer to do is to basically use a push or pull method. We're going to push our current score whenever it changes to our HUD, so that way it only changes when it changes. So what we want to do is we'll go ahead and go into our graph, and we have our score here. Let's make a new function in our HUD. We're going to call it, let's say, update score. So actually, let's make it a little more clear. Let's call it update score display. And this one's going to be pretty simple. All we do is take our text block and we set the text on it. And we're going to set it to whatever text we want to send into this event. Now by default, well, we can't send anything in. We need to update our function. On our details panel, we have an input. Let's create a new input called score because we're going to send it the new score. We'll change it to an integer type and we'll go ahead and compile and save. What we need to do is now plug our score into our input text. It's going to automatically convert it, and that's it. That's all we're going to need to do. Now anytime we want to update this value, we simply call the update score display with the new score on our HUD. So now that we have our HUD basically done, we don't need to do anything with it. We need to hook it up. So we're going to put it inside of our controller. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's do what we did with creating our crosshair. And on our begin play, we're going to go ahead and create a HUD event. So we'll go here, we'll create a widget. Now since we might need this widget for later use, we're going to go ahead and save it to a variable. We will promote to variable. And then we are going to add to viewport. Now this is basically the same thing we did before with our crosshair, except we're saving it to a variable. You notice I haven't sent anything up yet. We're going to do that now. We're going to create the HUD, compile, and then we're going to rename this variable. Let's call it HUD Widget. That way we know exactly what it does. Now the difference between this and our other version in our player is this is actually part of our main graph, whereas in our player it was in a function. But that is easy to actually change. If we select our nodes, right click on any of them and do collapse to function, it's going to go ahead and recreate what we did manually before. We'll name this create HUD, and if we go into it, we have everything we just created in a nice function already set up for us. So now if we were to play, we'll see our score on the bottom left and everything's still running like normal. Our score isn't updating because we're not telling it to update, but at least we've got our score on the screen. So we need to handle the next part. So there's a couple things here. We need an event inside of our controller that handles the score, and then we need something in our targets to actually tell our controller that our score has changed. So there's a couple ways of doing this. Since our targets are going to talk to the controller, let's just have the target send in a score, a point value. I'm going to tell the controller, hey, give the player this amount more points. And the controller is going to go, okay, let me add those points to our current score and then just update the display. So let's handle the controller portion first. Our controller needs to be able to take in a value and it needs to be able to update that score. Now we have a variable called player score. If you don't have it yet, go ahead and create it. I think I might have created it on accident earlier. Let's go ahead and delete it and make a new one. Let's do variables. We'll call it player score and we'll make it an integer. We'll go ahead and save that. There we go. Now we're on track. Everyone's got the same player score. Let's go ahead and create the function now. We'll do function and we'll call this function update score. What this is going to do is we're going to call update score, and update score is going to update the score, and it's going to handle everything appropriately as needed, such as maybe we need to make a flashy effect on the screen and then we need to update the HUD. Now when we update the score, we're going to need to know how much we're updating it. So we need to take our update score we need to add a new event called scored add, not event, new input, and we'll make it an integer. I'm working with integers just because it's going to make it a little bit simpler to do math, and then we're also going to just make it easier. I don't want targets to be worth 12.7 points. So we have score to add. We'll do some simple math. We're going to add the score to add to our existing player score. This is going to give us our new value for our player score. So we're going to set our player score in here somewhere. There we go. And now we've basically done the basics. We take in a value, add that value to our player score, and then set the player score to the new value. So now that we have our new player score, we need to update our widget. This is pretty simple. We have a reference to our widget right here. And inside of our widget, we have an event or a function called update score display. So let's do that. Let's do update score display. Let's actually try to save everything out. There we go. Whoops. There we go. Update. And you notice we're having a problem. Well, we have a problem because of the order that we created things. This is something to pay attention to. This may seem the same as another way of doing this, but it's not. Let's look at our order of operations. Let's find where we actually created. Okay, so we have our create HUD here. When we created these nodes, we created the HUD widget without a class. We promoted to a variable without a class, and then we added to a viewport. Then we went backwards and we created the class. Then we saved it and we renamed everything. Now, if we were to redo this in a different order, let's say create widget HUD, and then we promoted to a variable, you're going to actually notice a difference here. This variable is a user widget reference, the base class for a user widget. This variable is a HUD reference. It is actually of the type HUD, which has the parent of user reference. When we drug this out and created the variable, it created it of the type that was right here. Since this was set as a generic, it is generic. Since this is specific, this is specific. So due to that, if we were to go over to our update score and we were attempting to call our update display right here, update score display, it's not going to work because the HUD widget, which is a user widget, has no idea what the update score is. We'd have to cast to HUD and then update score display. Now there is a way around this. When I showed you this in here, creating the specific version, it created a specific version of the HUD widget that was the HUD type. We can easily just go ahead and fix that. Let's go in here. We'll go to our HUD widget and we'll change it from a user widget to a HUD. We know specifically what this is. We know this is a HUD reference, so we're going to change the variable type. And we're going to go and change it to the HUD itself. Now if we go back in here, you notice it says warning. We don't need to do that. We'll go in here. We'll type update score display, and look, it works. So keep that in mind. Blueprints are context sensitive, and the input and output nodes are smart. If you're telling it to create a variable, it's going to create it of the type you dragged it off. So if you create it as a generic actor, or in this case a user widget, it's not going to be the same as a child like the HUD. So now that we have this, we just need to hook up our score, do a little bit of fancy rerouting by double clicking. Everything has to look nice. And we now have our HUD update score function inside of our FPS controller. If we go ahead and run this again, well, nothing's going to happen. But we're almost there. So what have we set up so far? Well, we've set up an event and we've set up a function inside of our player controller called update score that is going to take in a score, update our player score, and update the HUD. Now we need to be able to get something into that. So what we want to do is in our event graph, we are going to create a new event for updating the score, and we're going to call our function for updating the score. Now, since we want to keep this generic, let's say, for example, we have more than one controller type, or let's say we have different targets talking to our controller, or just you want to try to keep references to a minimum, because if A references B and B references C and C references A, if any of them break, you can kind of have an issue with the chain breaking. But if you loosely reference them using interfaces, such as A can talk to B, but B doesn't have to actually be there, then you're not going to have an issue if B disappears. We'll use interfaces. So we want an interface on our controller for handling the update of the score. Let's go to our character, controller, and let's actually try to do this the proper way. Blueprint interface. FPS controller, blueprint interface, and we'll make a new blueprint interface. And this one's simple, handle, update, score. Now when we handle the updating score, we're going to need to take in a value. So we'll go ahead and set this up to value, and it's going to be an integer, and this will be the amount of score that we're going to update our score with, how much of a value it's going to be. Our target's going to call this. This is going to call its internal function. Its internal function will update the score, and our HUD will be all nice and happy. So that's all we need to do there. So let's go ahead and hook everything up. This should be pretty simple. We'll go ahead and, well, what should we do? Well, we've created the blueprint interface, but we need to actually assign it. So class settings, add controller blueprint interface, save, handle, update score for the add event, and hook it up. We have our nice little function here called update score. We'll hook everything up together. Now it may seem silly to basically have this event called, which just calls a function and not do anything else, but by doing it this way, all of this code right here is inside this little function hidden away instead of all of it over here. We're just trying to keep things compartmentalized, keep things in its own little section. Okay, so we're done with the controller. The controller will now update the score and update the HUD whenever this event gets called. So now we need to tell our target to call it. So an issue with that is inside of our target, if we can find where we hit our target, we have the HandleWasHit. And let's say we want to handle updating score. So handle update score. This is pretty simple. Okay. Let's actually put it before we destroy the actor so that way we don't break something. You don't want to destroy and then call an event because then the event may never actually get called. So we'll go with that. And let's give it a value of, let's give them 100 points. Now let's go ahead and run that. Well, you have an issue here. An error. You need a valid reference to call the handle update score on. We need to know, who are we supposed to call this on? Now, one of the reasons we set everything up the way we did was, let's say we adopt this into a multiplayer game. You're going to have multiple people shooting the same target, and you're going to want to make sure the target tells the appropriate person or controller the amount of score they should get. You don't want to randomly just tell someone. So we're going to need to know who hit us. We're also going to need to know how much they hit us for later on. So let's go ahead and actually just update this all at once. So our HandleWasHit event, which is in our blueprint interface, we'll open this up. And the nice thing is you can update things in real time. So we'll HandleWasHit. We're going to take in two inputs. Our first one is going to be our hitter, or who hit us. And our second one is going to be a damage value. or how much we were hit for. We're not going to use the damage value right now, but since we're going to be using it in the future, might as well use it. Now for our hitter, the nice thing about our hitter is it doesn't have to be specific. We don't care if let's say it's a turret later on that's controlled by AI, or it's an AI robot, or it's a player, or it's a grenade you throw, for example. We're just going to use the generic actor version. So let's go ahead and type in actor, properly, hopefully. And we'll just do actor, and we'll do a reference. And this is just going to give us a generic actor input. Because remember, when you're calling the blueprint interface, you don't have to call it on a specific class type. You can call it all the way down to basically the actor, because all your blueprints are actors. We'll go ahead and compile and save. Go back to our target blueprint, and you'll notice it's already updated. If not, you can always right-click the node and click refresh, and this will go ahead and redo it. Now, conveniently, we have a hitter, which is our target, and if we save, now whenever we call the HandleWasHit, it's going to call on whoever hit us, the update score event, and pass 100 points in, and then destroy itself. Well, let's see if it works. Score is 9999, we fire, nothing, and we fire nothing. Well, we still have a problem, apparently. So what is our actual issue here? If we go to our target, it was hit, handle updating score through the controller. We go to our controller, updating score, calls this, updates the score, updates the HUD. We go to our HUD, it goes to here, it updates the score value and sets the value. Well, let's debug and figure out why this isn't working. First things first, let's make sure we're being hit. This is where print string comes in handy. What we're going to do here is we've added a print string node to the HandleWasHit. Now, if we are hit, we should say hello. We'll go over here, we'll fire off, and we were hit. So we know at this point in time, this is being called. So our next thing is updating score. Is handle update score being called inside of our controller? Let's go to our controller. Let's go to handle update score, and let's print this out. We're only doing one print string at a time just so we can slowly walk through and try to eliminate our problems. We'll print fire, and we will notice it is not being called. So for whatever reason, this right here is not being called on whatever is hitting us. Now, why is that? Well, this one's actually pretty funny. Let me go back to here and remove my print string, and let's think about what we did. This is one of those instances where when you're in the middle of iterating over something and you do a big change, like we changed one of our interfaces, there are so many smaller things that we may have missed. One of them is when we are, here we go, calling our event handle hit, we are getting a hitter and we are getting a damage value. Well, where are these coming from? Well, this is supposed to come from our line trace, which is inside of our character. So if we pull up our character and we go in here, well, there's our problem. We never updated our HandleWasHit to actually call and pass along our hitter or damage value. If we were to go into here and pause during execution and hit fire, and we look, you'll find that your hitter is being passed in none and your damage value is being passed in none. Now, if you're wondering what I did, you can use the F9 or function 9 key to set a breakpoint. And what that does is whenever this part gets called during execution, it'll stop. And then you can easily mouse over anything to see the current value. And as you saw, we had none and 0. So let's go ahead and fix that. So we have, well, this is pretty simple. We have a hit actor, and this is the actor we hit. But that's not what we actually want. What we want to pass along is ourself or the controller, because we want the controller to be called whenever we hit something. And if you remember back to what I talked about earlier, the controller knows who the pawn is, and the pawn knows who the controller is. So if we did this, get controller, and hooked in our controller here, trying to avoid all this massive amount of, let's see if we can reorganize this a little bit more. Yeah, that looks better. Okay, we'll try that for now. There we go. And damage value, we'll put in a 1 for now, because why not? We're not using it, but why not? Okay, so what we've done here now is, when we call HandleWasHit, we pass in the controller. We run, we go back, and we fire, and now you see our score is updating properly. So if we were to close all these down and walk through it again, what we're going to find out is our character fires the line trace. If it hits something that is a target, it's going to call HandleWasHit on it. HandleWasHit is going to pass in the controller and a damage value. If we go to our target and we check out what it does, when it gets hit, it calls HandleUpdateScore on the target, which is our controller, and then destroys itself. If we go to the controller and we check out HandleWasUpdateScore, it takes the value that we passed in and calls UpdateScore. UpdateScore updates the score with the new value, talks to the HUD and says, okay, now you can update the score. We go to the HUD, it goes to its update score and says, okay, text block, go ahead and set yourself to this new value. Now, it may seem like a lot of stuff, but we've broken everything into different sections instead of one continuous chain. Now, for example, if we wanted the text to flash on the screen, we could have it handle it in the HUD. If, for example, we needed a particle effect to play on the controller, or we wanted the controller to maybe do a countdown, we can handle it in the update score event. When the target itself gets hit, right here, we're actually going to update this shortly with the damage value. And now it's separate instead of having one event handling it. The character itself, it's going to have a damage value that may be changed based on other parameters. And it might be separate, so we keep it separate. So by keeping everything separate, it allows us to add modules, add changes very easily. Now we have one less bug left. We're going to go ahead and knock that out right now. As you notice, when we ran the game, it starts off with a score of 9999. So we're going to go ahead and fix that so that way it starts off with 0. Now this should be a pretty simple way of doing this. What we want to do is, it's our controller. And our controller should set the default value to 0 when it starts. So what is the easiest way of doing that? Well, in our begin game, we can go ahead and have it set to 0. Or we can go ahead and set our HUD to, there's two different ways. Let's walk through it. Here's our HUD, here's our score, change it to 0, we're done. Well, one thing you might want to do is actually initialize things properly. So when we are setting everything up here, we have our update score event. And when we are creating our setup here, maybe we want to go ahead and update the score when it's starting. So let's go ahead and inside of our controller, let's call the update score with a value of 0. Let's go ahead and run this. And now you see score of 0. Because we had created a function to handle updating the score, we can easily fix smaller bugs like this just by simply walking through our process. So when we begin the play, we create our HUD, and then we update our score to 0. So that's it. That's going to wrap up this video. In the next video, what we're going to do is actually utilize the damage value that we created inside of our target blueprint. And we're going to go ahead and add score values to our targets that are adjustable and update that on the display.